That is what distinguishes Auschwitz from any previous massacre in human history. That someone sat at a drawing board, calculated dimensions, chose materials, approved budgets. That an SS architect named Karl Bischoff signed on October 14, 1941, the complete blueprint of a camp that would process more than 1 million human lives as if they were raw material. That a company named Topf und Söhne from Erfurt sent technical letters discussing the resistance of bricks to the temperatures of the crematorium ovens, bricks that had to withstand the heat of burning human bodies. Between 1940 and 1945, at least 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz. 1,100,000 were murdered. 1 in 6 Jews killed in the Holocaust died there, 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow, along the Sola River, a plain where the morning mist did not rise until well into the morning and where the winters, from November until March, turned the ground into a block of ice that did not spare even the most robust. There, in the spring of 1940, there were 22 abandoned brick barracks. 8 had 2 floors, the others a single one. They had been built by the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War to house troops. They had been used afterwards by the Polish army. They were ordinary buildings, without any redeeming quality or any sinister trait, functional, grey, surrounded by the town of Oświęcim, whose German name was Auschwitz. The town had about 12,000 inhabitants before the war. It had a market, churches, a Jewish community that had been rooted in its streets for centuries. It was the type of place that did not appear on any map of strategic importance until someone decided it should appear. The proposal to convert those abandoned barracks into a concentration camp came from SS Hauptsturmführer Arpad Wiegand, inspector of the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police, and deputy to SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, higher SS and police leader for Silesia. The reasoning was administrative and urgent. The prisons in the region had been saturated with Polish political prisoners for months. Since the invasion of September 1939, the German occupation had unleashed mass arrests of intellectuals, priests, teachers, army officers, community leaders. The Reich needed space to contain them. Wiegand saw the barracks and saw a solution. Richard Glucks, head of the SS concentration camps inspectorate, sent SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Eisfeld, former commander of the Sachsenhausen camp in Oranienburg, to evaluate the site. Eisfeld inspected, measured, studied the layout of the buildings, reviewed the perimeter. He rendered a report. The site was viable. On April 27, 1940, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler officially approved the creation of the camp, but the approval needed an executor. Rudolf Höss was 38 years old when Himmler appointed him as the first commander of Auschwitz. Born in Baden-Baden on November 25, 1901, son of a devout Catholic merchant who had dreamed of sending him to the seminary, his life had taken a radically different turn. During the Weimar Republic, he participated in one of the so-called Femimord, extrajudicial killings perpetrated by far-right paramilitary organizations, for which he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released in 1928 under an amnesty. In 1934, he entered the SS upon direct recommendation from Himmler. He served under Theodor Eicke in Dachau, the man who had invented and codified the Nazi concentration camp system. Then, in Sachsenhausen, he learned the methods, the bureaucracy of organized death. When they assigned him Auschwitz, Höss was exactly what the system needed. A competent, methodical administrator with no visible scruples, with no tendencies toward moral reflection. Höss settled in Auschwitz with his wife Hedwig and his 5 children. The house was made of stucco, 2 floors located next to the headquarters building. From the upper windows, the distance to the first prisoner blocks was less than 100 meters. He lived in that house for years. His children played in the garden while on the other side of the wall the prisoners died. The first 30 prisoners arrived on May 20, 1940, transferred from Sachsenhausen, German common criminals. The first of them, prisoner number 1, was Bruno Brodniewicz, designated Lagerältester, the camp elder. They were called the Grünen, the Greens, due to the green triangle sewn onto their uniforms. They were the German underworld transplanted to a Polish plane with new powers over human lives. And they used them from day one with a brutality that structured the tone of the camp during its first months of existence. On June 14, 1940, the first mass transport of importance arrived. 728 Polish political prisoners coming from Tarnow. university professors, lawyers, doctors, Catholic priests, and a smaller number of Jews. They received serial numbers 31 to 758. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum recognizes that June 14th as the foundational date of the camp in its official documents. The people on that train came from a city that had suffered the consequences of the intelligence action, the systematic program of the Gestapo to arrest and eliminate Polish intellectual and community elites. The previous May 18th, the Gestapo had swept Tarnow in a single operation. By the end of 1940, the SS had confiscated all the surrounding lands to create a zone of interest, Interessengebiet, of 40 square kilometers, permanently patrolled by the SS, the Gestapo, and local police. Any civilian who entered without express authorization could be arrested. The villagers remained within that exclusion zone as captive witnesses, as background figures in a scenery they had not chosen. Höss wrote to Glucks on July 12, 1940, that the local population was fanatically Polish, ready to undertake any type of operation against the hated SS men. It was an honest evaluation of the context in which the camp existed, not in the isolation of some empty wasteland, but in the middle of an inhabited region with civilian witnesses a few kilometers away, with the smell of the crematoria reaching the neighboring villages when the wind blew from the camp. By March 1941, the number of registered prisoners in Auschwitz had reached 10,900. The majority, Polish, the prisoners themselves built the camp that imprisoned them. With 11-hour workdays, they added second floors to the existing buildings, installed electrified fences, laid barbed wire. The brick blocks that can be visited today carry that history in their walls. There is an almost visible line where the brick of 1940 meets the brick of 1943, built by hands that in many cases did not survive to see the finished result. The prisoner classification system was designed with the characteristic efficiency of the Nazi bureaucracy. Each one had their hair shaved upon arrival, was disinfected, was assigned a serial number, and was given the striped uniform. Above the number, a fabric triangle was sewn. Red for political prisoners, mostly Polish, green for common criminals, black for the so-called asocials, vagrants, homeless people, Romani, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for homosexuals, mostly German. Jews wore a yellow Star of David formed by two overlapping triangles with a letter indicating their nationality. Auschwitz was the only camp where prisoners were tattooed. Soviet prisoners of war received the number on the left chest. Civilians on the left forearm, on the inner side. The ink was supplied by the Pelican Company, which still exists today as a commercial brand. The tattooing system began from 1941 in response to the high mortality rate. When bodies had been too deteriorated to be identified by the uniform, the number on the skin remained legible. Within the camp, there existed an explicit racial hierarchy. German prisoners occupied the highest echelon of the internal system. Next, non-Jews of other nationalities. At the base, the Jews, who were also forbidden from receiving correspondence. The other prisoners, under normal conditions, could write to their families in German on Sundays. Jews could not. They were also forbidden from possessing watches or calendars. It was a deliberate deprivation of the notion of time, not knowing what day it was, in what month, how much time had passed since they arrived. Only 2 Jewish calendars clandestinely manufactured inside the camp survived until liberation. That hierarchy was not an improvisation. It was the Nazi ideology operating as a management system. The camp that Höss built in 1940 had an exceptional mortality rate, but prisoners died from hunger, from disease, from the beatings of the Kapos, and the SS extermination as a planned state policy would arrive later. 2 events would trigger it: the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, and the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942. But by then, Auschwitz had already been transforming for a year. The day began before dawn, at 4:30 in the morning in summer, at 5:30 in winter, the only concession the system made to the Polish cold. A metallic gong resonated through the blocks. The Blockschreiber, or the Stubendienst, the barracks supervisor, immediately beat the inmates with sticks or with his hands to force them to get up. There was no room for slowness, for pain, for the confusion of waking up. The first objective of the day was personal hygiene, in theory. In practice, resources made hygiene an almost unattainable aspiration. In Auschwitz I, the washhouse was a community building where dozens or hundreds of men had to wash simultaneously with cold water. frequently dirty, and without soap. The available time was barely minutes. Primo Levi described the washhouse of Auschwitz III in 1944 as a place badly lit, full of drafts, with the brick floor covered by a layer of mud. The walls, he wrote, were decorated with frescoes showing the good prisoner, shaved head, diligently soaping himself, and the bad prisoner, with a pronounced Semitic nose with dirty clothes. Underneath the first one, so bist du rein, this is how you are clean. Underneath the second one, so gehst du ein, this is how you end up badly. The latrines presented their own conditions of systematic horror. In Sector B-IA of Auschwitz-II-Birkenau, the toilets were concrete channels with 58 holes for sitting, accessible only twice a day, morning and evening, and for a strictly limited time. A prisoner was specifically assigned to measure how long the workers took to use the facilities. Those who took too long were beaten. The gynecologist Gisela Perl, who survived the women's camp and published her testimony in 1948, wrote that there was one latrine for between 30,000 and 32,000 women, and that they were only allowed to use it at certain times of the day. She described how the latrine consisted of planks over a deep ditch, where the women crouched so tightly that, in her words, we could not avoid dirtying one another. Given that dysentery and intestinal infections were endemic, a direct consequence of malnutrition, contaminated water and overcrowding, the restriction of access to sanitary facilities created a perverse cycle of illness and punishment. The roll call followed the washing. The prisoners came out of the barracks and lined up in the courtyard in rows of 10. The appel, the recount, could last from a few minutes to endless hours, depending on the humor of the SS officers on duty and on whether the total number of prisoners squared. If someone was missing, due to having died during the night, due to being incapacitated in the infirmary, due to having tried to escape, the recount began again. The prisoners remained standing, attention, regardless of the temperature, the rain, the snow. On July 6, 1940, the roll call lasted 19 hours because Tadeusz Wiejowski had escaped. Hundreds of prisoners remained standing for an entire night and most of the following day. Whoever collapsed was forced to get up. Whoever could not get up was dragged. In 1941, after another escape, the system of collective reprisal was implemented, which became a permanent norm. When someone escaped, a group of prisoners from the same barracks as the fugitive was randomly selected and sent to Block 11 to die of hunger in the starvation cell. The effect on the collective psychology was calculated. It turned each prisoner into an implicit guardian of the others. Solidarity and mutual vigilance were transformed into instruments of the control system. The guards could impose additional punishments during the roll call for reasons bordering on the arbitrary. A missing button on the uniform, a poorly washed food plate, a posture that did not seem straight enough. Inmates could be forced to squat with their hands on their heads for an hour. They could be beaten on the spot. They could be registered for formal punishment, which included flogging, the post, hanging by the arms tied to the back, or being sent to Block 11. After the roll call, to the sound of Arbeitskommandos formieren, form work groups, the prisoners marched in columns of 5 toward their work posts. But before leaving, the music. An orchestra of prisoners was forced to play cheerful music, marches, popular pieces, lively melodies, while the workers went out through the camp gates toward their workdays. The same music played upon return. The official reason was twofold: to facilitate the step in orderly columns and to simplify the recount for the guards. The effect on the prisoners was of a particular cruelty that several survivors described with similar words. The incongruity between the melody and the destination was physically disturbing to them. Alma Rosé, niece of the composer Gustav Mahler and one of the most brilliant violinists in Europe at that time, directed the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz until her death in the camp in 1944. The workday normally lasted 11 hours. Much of the work was carried out outdoors: construction sites, quarries, gravel pits, sawmills, agricultural work. Without breaks, the Polish cold from November to March could descend below 20 degrees below zero. The thin, striped fabric uniforms did not provide sufficient thermal protection to work outdoors under those conditions. Without gloves, without additional socks, frequently with shoes that were not the correct size or that had deteriorated beyond any function. Viktor Frankl, a Viennese psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and other camps and published his reflections in Man's Search for Meaning, wrote that on occasions it was so cold that the prisoners urinated on themselves to warm up momentarily. He also described how a piece of wire found on the ground, to be able to tie the sole of the shoe that was separating, could literally determine whether a prisoner survived the following week. Without adequate protection for the feet, ulcers developed in days, and ulcers led to infections that led to selection for the gas chamber. The diet was calculated to keep the prisoners functional long enough to be useful without any consideration of long-term survival. Breakfast consisted of half a litre of a coffee substitute or a herbal infusion. No solid food. Lunch was 3/4 of a litre of watery soup, which prisoners consistently described as unpleasant in taste or directly repulsive. 4 times a week it contained some pieces of potato or rutabaga. Dinner was the most consistent ration. 300 grams of bread, frequently mouldy, with a tablespoon of melted cheese or jam, or 25 grams of margarine, or a small piece of sausage. Subsequent medical calculations established that this diet represented between 1,300 and 1,700 daily calories for men performing intense physical work for 11 hours. The basic caloric need of a man in those conditions is approximately 3,500 to 4,000 calories. The deficit was between 50 and 60%. The result was inevitable and, according to evidence documented by the historian Peter Hayes, was calculated. In the IG Farben camp in Monowitz, prisoners were reduced to walking skeletons within a period of 3 to 4 months. The photographs taken by the Red Army upon liberating the camp in January 1945, prisoners with sunken cheekbones and huge eyes in faces without fat, are not the casual result of the ravages of war. They are the product of a feeding program deliberately designed to consume human beings down to their minimum functional expression. The day ended around 7 in the evening. A second roll call was carried out in the courtyard. If any prisoner had died during the day, the corpse had to be brought back to the camp and presented in the recount. The numbers had to square. The work companions of the deceased carried the body. During the evening roll call, public hangings or floggings could occur. The ritual had an explicit exemplary function. The rest of the camp was forced to observe. The curfew at 9 at night. The bunks of Auschwitz I were wooden structures on 3 levels that housed up to 1,000 people in the worst moments of overcrowding. Originally designed for 1 person per compartment, over time they passed to house 2, 3, and even 4 people in the same space. The Hungarian doctor Miklos Niszli, who survived Auschwitz working under the orders of Josef Mengele and published his testimony, described, "From 800 to 1,000 people were crowded into the overlapping compartments of each barracks. Unable to stretch out completely, they slept both lengthwise and crosswise, with the feet of one man on the head, the neck, or the chest of another." In the brick barracks, the prisoners lay on straw, in the wooden ones on mattresses stuffed with sawdust or pressed straw. Blankets existed in insufficient numbers. In winter, the interior temperature of the barracks could drop several degrees below zero. The prisoners slept with their clothes on, the only ones they had, and with their shoes under their body to prevent them from being stolen during the night. The Sunday, there was a single concession. There was no mandatory work. The prisoners had to clean the barracks, undergo the only weekly bath, a quick shower with cold water, frequently without soap, and they could write in German to their families. The letters were censored by the SS before being sent. Those who did not speak German exchanged part of their bread ration so that someone else would help them write the authorized lines. That was the life of those who had passed the selection. Those who did not pass it had another destiny. The Zyklon B arrived in Auschwitz to kill lice. It was a pesticide of industrial use, developed from research on hydrocyanic acid, hydrogen cyanide, carried out, among others, by the German chemist Fritz Haber, who paradoxically was Jewish and had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. Zyklon B was manufactured in the form of small crystals or pellets impregnated with the active compound, designed to be poured into enclosed spaces where its evaporation eliminated insects. The company that produced and distributed it was Degesch, a subsidiary of the powerful IG Farben. In Auschwitz, Zyklon B was of routine use since the first months of existence of the camp. It was stored on the second floor of Block 3 of Auschwitz I, in some disinfection chambers where the uniforms, blankets, and other objects of the prisoners were treated to eliminate the lice that inevitably proliferated in the conditions of overcrowding. The bluish stains that the compound left on the brick walls were visible decades after the war. The jump from crystals to kill lice to crystals to kill people occurred in the summer of 1941, initiated by an officer who described it later as an experiment of efficiency. The historian Nikolaus Waxman, in his work KL, A History of the Nazi Concentration Camps, 2015, points out that the first lethal test with Zyklon B took place toward the end of August 1941, when SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritsch, deputy Lagerführer of the camp, supervised the execution of a small group of Soviet prisoners with the compound. Fritsch, according to documented testimonies, later credited himself with having invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The commander Rudolf Höss quickly approved carrying out a broader test. For that second test, the SS cleared Block 11, the so-called Block of Death, the center of tortures and executions of the camp. The doors were sealed and the windows were boarded up with cement. A day in early September 1941. The historical consensus places the date around September 5th, although Waxman specifies that it was probably September 5th. A train coming from the Neuhammer prisoner of war camp in Lower Silesia arrived in Auschwitz. Hundreds of inmates got off the wagons. All were Soviet prisoners of war identified by the Gestapo as commissars. When they paraded through the complex, night had already fallen. The silence was interrupted by the barking of the guard dogs and the shouts of the guards. Some inmates who slept in the adjacent barracks peered through the windows and broke the rules by doing so. They saw long columns of men illuminated by flashlights disappear toward Block 11. With those men, about 250 invalid prisoners selected from the camp hospital also went down to the basement. The SS threw the Zyklon B crystals inside and closed the doors. Upon contact with the warm air and the bodies of the captives, the prussic acid began to emanate. Waxman collects the testimony of the Polish prisoner Adam Zakarski, witness to the subsequent opening of the basement. The scene was truly hair-raising because it could be seen that those people had scratched and bitten one another in a fit of madness before dying. Many had their uniforms torn. Although I had already grown accustomed to seeing some macabre scenes in the camp, at the sight of all those murdered men I felt dizzy and began to vomit uncontrollably. Höss, who had supervised the operation from the exterior with other SS men, took off his gas mask and congratulated himself. Hundreds of prisoners had been executed without any SS agent having had to fire a single shot. But Höss saw room for improvement. Block 11 was too far from the crematorium. The corpses had to be dragged through the entire camp. Furthermore, the building lacked its own ventilation and had to be aired out for a long time before the SS could force other prisoners to go down to remove the bodies. The solution was to transfer the gassing operations to the morgue of Crematorium 1. It was located outside the complex of the main camp, which meant fewer unwanted witnesses. It had capacity for hundreds of victims and had effective ventilation. The doors were protected. Holes were drilled in the ceiling to be able to introduce the Zyklon B from the roof. The corpses would be incinerated in the adjacent crematorium ovens. The SS of Auschwitz had built the first prototype of a death factory in a concentration camp. The first test in this new location arrived in mid-September 1941, when approximately 900 Soviet prisoners of war were gassed in the crematorium. As they arrived, the SS agents ordered them to undress and forced them to enter the morgue, supposedly to disinfect them. Then the doors were sealed and the gas crystals were thrown in. Höss described the scene in the memoirs written during his captivity before execution. After the introduction, some shouted "gas," which was followed by powerful screams and pushing toward the doors. But these withstood the pressure. Incinerating all the bodies, he added, took several days. Höss wrote also that the gas method disturbed him less than the mass executions by shooting, which had been the practice of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front. He had seen soldiers become ill and break down morally upon being forced to shoot civilians at close range. The gas, he argued in his writings, allowed to distance the executioners from the act. It provided him, in his own words, greater peace of mind. This rationalization found its most systematic expression on January 20th, 1942. In a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 high officials of the Nazi government and the SS met for approximately 90 minutes under the chairmanship of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich to coordinate what they euphemistically termed the final solution to the Jewish question. The protocol of the meeting, written by Adolf Eichmann and preserved in the archives, describes in bureaucratic language the plan for the systematic extermination of the 11 million European Jews identified in the calculations of the participants. Waxman points out a detail that is usually overlooked. At the Wannsee meeting, there was no representative from the concentration camp system. Concentration camps were not on the initial agenda. Barely days after the conference, however, the SS leaders changed perspective. The trigger was the final acceptance that the plans to employ Soviet prisoners of war as slave labor had failed. Too many had died in the first weeks. Substitutes were needed. On January 26, 1942, barely 6 days after Wannsee, Himmler sent a telex to the camp inspector, Richard Glucks. They must prepare to house 100,000 Jews and up to 50,000 Jewish women in the concentration camp in the next 4 weeks. Auschwitz was already operational when Wannsee took place, but Wannsee accelerated it and institutionalized it. The crematorium, one of Auschwitz I, had 3 ovens with capacity to burn 340 bodies in 24 hours. When its adjacent morgue was transformed into a gas chamber, the entire complex acquired a new function. The interior walls were painted white. Fake shower heads were installed on the ceiling to reinforce the illusion that the space was a shower room. Airtight iron doors were built. Openings were drilled in the ceiling through which the Zyklon B would be introduced from the exterior. The capacity of that first chamber was of between 700 and 800 people simultaneously. In December 1942, the last prisoners gassed in crematorium one of Auschwitz I were approximately 400 members of the Sonderkommando itself, the prisoners forced to operate the Extermination facilities, who had been working in Auschwitz II. They had been forced to dig up and burn the remains of the mass graves of that camp, calculated at more than 100,000 corpses. Once that task was completed, they were brought back to Auschwitz I and gassed. The system systematically eliminated its own witnesses. The decision to build Auschwitz II was not taken suddenly. It was the product of an accumulation of pressures that converged in the autumn of 1941. Heinrich Himmler had visited Auschwitz-Birkenau in March of that year, in the company of Richard Glucks and summoned by his own expansionist ambitions. And what he saw confirmed to him that the existing camp was insufficient for the purposes that the regime had in mind. The estimates of the war against the Soviet Union, initiated on June 22, 1941, spoke of tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war who would need to be contained. The plans for the final solution, still in the process of formation, would require facilities of a completely different scale. The construction of Auschwitz II-Birkenau began in October 1941 in Brzezinka, Birkenau in German, an agricultural village 3 kilometers from the main camp. 7 villages were eliminated to make space for the new complex, their Polish inhabitants expelled, their houses demolished or appropriated. Birkenau means in German birch forest. The camp was officially designated in the blueprints as Kriegsgefangenenlager, prisoner of war camp. It was a false bureaucratic designation, an administrative cover for a purpose that the planners themselves already knew would go much further. SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, SS architect and head of the construction directorate, the Bauleitung of Auschwitz, supervised the design and construction. His office, established on October 1, 1941, employed both SS officers with technical training and prisoners with knowledge of architecture or engineering. His archives, which the Nazis forgot to destroy when they burned the main archives of the camp, the blueprints were kept in a different building, survived the war and constituted one of the most extraordinary documentary collections on the Nazi planning of the extermination. Among those survived documents, the blueprint dated October 14, 1941, of the complete camp of Birkenau, the blueprint of October 8, 1941, for a barracks with capacity for 550 prisoners, signed by Bischoff himself. The blueprints of crematoria 2 and 3 of November 1941, a 2-dimensional sketch of the entrance to the camp that would become the most recognized image of the Holocaust. In 2009, the German newspaper Bild acquired 29 of these documents, presented them to the then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a ceremony in Berlin, and deposited them in the Yad Vashem archives. The initial budget approved was 8.9 million Reichsmarks. It soon proved insufficient. The original plan of Bischoff foresaw barracks with capacity for 550 prisoners each. But the demand for space grew with such rapidity that Bischoff revised the figure to 744 per barracks. With that density, the camp could house 125,000 people instead of the 97,000 initially foreseen. The revision was approved without significant objections. The barracks of Birkenau had a particular origin. Many were wooden structures of uniform appearance, originally designed, in an irony that the SS architects themselves probably did not notice, as stables for horses of the German army. Each one measured 35.4 by 11 meters, divided into 62 compartments of 4 square meters. Each compartment was subdivided into roosts, the term that the prisoners used for the stepped wooden platforms where they slept, initially designed for 3 people, expanded to 4 when the pressure of space demanded it. Waxman cites in his history the calculations themselves of the SS planners. The surface area assigned to each inmate was, in their words, of the same size as a coffin. A Polish prisoner named Alfred Czesław Przybylski, who worked on the construction of Birkenau, declared in the testimonies collected by the museum that the choice of the site, on swampy ground when there was dry ground available a short distance away, had not been accidental. I have the firm conviction that the choice of the site on wet ground had the intention to exterminate the prisoners who worked there and also those who would inhabit the buildings. Swampy means soils that turned into mires with the rain, cold that penetrated from below into the wooden bunks, stagnant water that favored mosquitoes and illnesses. The wooden barracks lacked effective thermal insulation. In winter, the cold was brutal. In summer, the heat was suffocating. The windows in many barracks could not be opened. The guards forbade ventilation, probably to impede communication between blocks or simply as another form of control. Romano Frister, a writer who survived Birkenau, recalled decades later the winter nights in the barracks. The seasons changed according to the logic of nature. Winter whipped us with its whip of frost. On the contrary to the factory, in which a pleasant heat reigned, the barracks were never heated, and the stoves in them were used as tables. After the evening formation, which lasted forever, there was no place in which we could warm ourselves. We went to sleep without taking off our clothes, sometimes without taking off our shoes. The first prisoners to inhabit Birkenau while constructing it were the 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war who arrived between October 7th and 25th, 1941. They lived in the mud in unfinished buildings without heating, with minimal rations. By March 1st, 1942, only 945 remained registered. The others, more than 9,000 in less than 5 months, had died of cold, hunger, and illness. A testimony preserved by the museum, coming from a former prisoner whose identity is not specified, describes the barracks in that period. On rainy days, the rammed earth floor of the barracks turned into a swamp as a consequence of the lack of drainage. The huts were originally prepared for 500 people. The order of the construction director, which mandated adding a third level of bunks, caused the capacity to increase to 800 to 1,000 prisoners per barracks. Often on each bunk, 10 to 12 people were lying instead of 4. Birkenau reached its peak in May 1944, when it came to have simultaneously 90,000 registered prisoners in its more than 300 barracks. But that figure of 90,000 does not reflect the real traffic of people who passed through the camp. The majority of those who arrived on the trains were never registered. They passed directly from the wagons to the gas chamber. Herta Soswinski, a prisoner who worked as an office worker in the construction directorate, declared after the war, "The task of the Bauleitung consisted in planning all the construction works within Auschwitz, including the housing blocks, medical facilities, crematoria, gas chambers. It was an extraordinarily calm description of what it meant to plan industrial facilities for mass murder." Birkenau had 4 crematoria with integrated gas chambers, crematoria 2, 3, 4 and 5, built between 1942 and 1943 with official capacity to process 4,416 bodies every 24 hours. In the moments of greatest pressure, the Sonderkommando, the prisoners forced to operate the crematoria, could reach approximately 8,000 daily cremations, loading 3 to 5 corpses simultaneously into each oven. The blueprint that Bischoff signed on October 14, 1941, already contemplated the facilities that would turn Birkenau into the largest complex of extermination in history. The blueprints of crematoria 2 and 3 of Auschwitz-Birkenau were drawn with millimetric precision. Each one consisted of 3 elements integrated into a single complex: an undressing room, Auskleiderraum, with numbered coat hooks on the walls, an underground gas chamber of 30 meters by 7 meters of surface area, and an oven room with operational capacity of 1,440 bodies in 24 hours. Crematoria 4 and 5, of different design, had their changing rooms and gas chambers on the ground floor, with a capacity of 768 daily bodies each. The construction company was Topf und Söhne from Erfurt. Its archives, preserved in part after the war, document the meticulous technical correspondence between the civil engineers and the SS of Auschwitz. In those letters, they discussed the resistance of bricks to the temperatures of the ovens, the capacity of the elevators that carried the corpses from the underground changing rooms to the oven rooms, the air extraction systems. They were letters of industrial engineering. Their content was the design of facilities to burn human beings. In June 1943, the 4 crematoria were in full operation. The process to which the victims were subjected was designed in every detail to maintain calm until the last moment. They were led downstairs to the undressing rooms. The SS instructors told them that after the shower, they would receive hot coffee. The signs on the walls pointed out the importance of remembering the number of the coat hook where they had left their clothes to be able to recover them later. The fake shower heads installed on the ceiling of the gas chamber completed the illusion. The automobile that transported the Zyklon B carried painted the Red Cross of the medical service. The SS doctor who accompanied the column was there to ensure that no SS officer resulted accidentally poisoned during the process. When the chamber was full, it could house up to 2,000 people, the airtight doors closed. The SS men with gas masks approached the openings in the ceiling. They opened the cans of Zyklon B. They poured the bluish crystals toward the interior. Lieb Langfuss, a member of the Sonderkommando, buried his diary written in Yiddish near Crematorium 3. It was found in 1952. In it, he wrote about what he heard from the other side of the closed doors. Voices that gradually weakened, screams that transformed into sobs, and finally into silence. The process of death took between 10 and 20 minutes. Rudolf Höss declared before the Nuremberg prosecutors that it took up to 20 minutes. The bodies, according to the testimony itself of the surviving Sonderkommando, piled up in strata when the chamber was full. At the bottom, the weakest, children, elderly women; in the middle, the less strong; at the summit, the youngest and most robust, who had climbed desperately toward the last centimeters of unpoisoned air. When the doors opened, the Sonderkommando began their work. They removed the glasses, the dental prostheses, the orthopedic appliances. They shaved the hair of the women. In Auschwitz, unlike other camps, the hair was cut after death. By February 6, 1943, the Reich Ministry of Economics had received 3,000 kilograms of hair coming from Auschwitz and Majdanek. The process was industrial. It was cleaned in ammonium chloride solution, dried, combed, packed in paper bags, sent to textile factories in Germany. When the Red Army liberated the camp in January 1945, it found 7,000 kilograms of human hair in bags ready to be sent. The gold extracted from the teeth, by order of Himmler, since September 23, 1940, was sent to the SS Health Service to be used by the dentists of the Corps. At the beginning of 1944, between 10 and 12 kilograms of gold were extracted monthly from the teeth of the victims. The ashes were buried, thrown into the Vistula River, or used as fertilizer in the agricultural fields adjacent to the camp. The remains of bone that had not burned completely were crushed in wooden mortars. The system eliminated even the last evidences. The journey began with a lie. The deportees were told that they were going to be resettled to the east, that they were going to work, that their families would remain together. Many had received instructions to carry with them their objects of value, their tableware, the photos of their loved ones. The suitcases confiscated in Auschwitz often carried the names of their owners painted with care, the dates of birth, the cities of origin. They had been marked for a reunion that would never occur. The transports arrived in Auschwitz from all occupied Europe, from Hungary between 1 and 3 days, depending on the exact origin, from Greece, from Thessaloniki, where one of the oldest Jewish communities of the Mediterranean lived, with more than 500 years of continuous history in that city. The journey could last 10 days or more, from France, between 2 and 3 days. From the Netherlands, approximately 3. The wagons were for freight, designed to transport cattle or merchandise, without seats, without windows, or with minimal windows covered with wires. without bathrooms, a bucket in the corner of the wagon for several hundred people, without guaranteed drinking water, without guaranteed food. In the worst cases, the overcrowding was such that people could not sit. They remained standing for hours or days, pushed against other people, breathing the fouled air of the closed wagon. In summer, the heat could be deadly. In winter, the cold penetrated through the wooden planks. Many died during the transit. The corpses remained in the wagon along with the survivors until the doors opened. The Alte Judenrampe, the Old Jewish Ramp, was the unloading platform of the Oswiecim freight station used from 1942 until May 1944. It was located between Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II-Birkenau, 2.5 kilometers from the gas chambers of the second camp. The deportees had to walk that distance in columns supervised by guards armed with dogs. In May 1944, to manage the transports of Hungarian Jews, which at their moment of greatest intensity reached 12,000 people daily, the railway branch line that penetrated directly within the perimeter of Birkenau up to the heart of the camp was completed. The new ramp was located a few meters from crematoria 2 and 3. The train entered through the arch of the watchtower, advanced slowly along the interior tracks, and stopped. From that moment, the route to death was measured in meters. The Auschwitz album, the series of photographs taken by the identification team of the camp in May and June 1944 during the Hungarian deportations, constitutes the most complete visual record that exists of the selection process. More than 200 photographs document the arrival of the trains, the descent of the deportees, the formation of columns, the selection process. The photos show entire families, men with hats, women with coats, children holding hands, elderly leaning on canes. They also show the SS doctors pointing with their finger, but those photographs were taken by the SS themselves. They represent their vision of the process, orderly, controlled, efficient. Absent from them are the terror, the chaos, the screams of the children separated from their mothers. The selection process was frequently presided over by Josef Mengele, who arrived in Auschwitz II on May 30th, 1943. According to the testimonies collected by the Auschwitz Museum, he frequently arrived elegantly uniformed, with white gloves, riding crop in hand. Sometimes music was arranged for the moment of arrival, popular or classical melodies projected by loudspeakers of the camp. The contrast between the music and the destiny of the newcomers formed part of the mechanism of disorientation. Mengele announced on the platform, according to the consistent testimony of multiple survivors, Zwillinge heraus, twins, a step forward. His specific interest in identical twins determined for them a different destiny. Not the immediate gas chamber, but the experiments of Block 10, a life somewhat longer but not necessarily less terrible. For the rest, the selection criterion was codified. The general guidelines were clear. All children under 14 or 15 years were sent directly to the gas chamber. A stick placed at a certain height was used. Those who could pass underneath were selected for death. All women who arrived with small children in arms were sent to the gas chamber. All the elderly, all those who presented visible signs of illness or incapacity, bandages, evident scars, limping, extreme emaciation. Practically any defect, wrote the historian Raoul Hilberg in his monumental work The Destruction of the European Jews, could be sufficient reason to be considered unfit for work. Those selected to work, approximately between 20 and 25% of the deportees in most of the transports, were registered as prisoners, received a serial number, and were incorporated into the camp. The remaining 75 or 80% were led toward the crematoria following a path meticulously designed to maintain calm and avoid panic. They were instructed to remember their belongings. They were indicated the direction with reassuring gestures. They were spoken to in a neutral or even friendly tone. The SS knew that if the victims understood what awaited them, the logistical process would complicate exponentially. The system of deception had been designed specifically for the volume of people it had to process. According to the estimates of the historian Franciszek Piper in the period of maximum activity, May to July 1944, during the Hungarian deportations, the crematoria of Birkenau functioned literally without rest. In those days, when 12,000 people daily arrived on trains and the greater part were led directly from the platform to the gas chamber, the Sonderkommando had to resort to cremation in the open air in pits excavated behind the buildings. The columns of smoke were visible from kilometers around. The smell reached the neighboring villages. In total, according to the calculations of Piper published in 1991 by Yad Vashem, of the approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews deported to Auschwitz between May 14th and the beginning of July 1944, around 320,000 were murdered in the gas chambers in that same period, 75% of the total in less than 2 months. The Sonderkommando that operated the crematoria recorded what they saw. One of its members, whose identity remains unknown, made with charcoal the drawings of the so-called Auschwitz notebook, 22 illustrations that show the process from the descent from the train to the ovens. In the images, one can see what the photographs of the official album do not show: the fear on the faces, the forced separation of families, the piled bodies. Near Crematorium 3, Salman Leuenthal buried his notebooks written in Yiddish. They were found in 1962. At 7 kilometers east of Auschwitz I, between the localities of Dwory and Monowitz, the chemical conglomerate IG Farben chose in 1941 a site to build a factory of synthetic rubber essential for the German war effort. The choice was not casual. The Oststeuergesetz of December 1940 offered tax exemptions to corporations willing to develop industries in the border regions of the East. And a few kilometers from that available land, there was something that no other location could offer: the concentration camp of Auschwitz, with its supply of practically free labor. Waxman details that IG Farben was brought fundamentally by the proximity of natural resources and good communications, but that the possibility of having forced laborers at the price of 3 or 4 Reichsmarks per prisoner and day was a central component of the economic calculation. In February 1941, Himmler ordered that the Jewish population of Oswiecim be expelled to make room for the specialized German workers. The prisoners of the camp began to work on the demolition of houses in Monowitz in April of that year. By May, several hundred prisoners got up at 3 in the morning to walk twice a day from Auschwitz I to the construction site because trucks were scarce. When the SS administrators worried that a long line of exhausted prisoners crossing the city of Oswiecim could damage German-Polish relations, they ordered the prisoners to shave daily, keep themselves clean, and sing while marching. In October 1942, the complex was finished. IG Farben paid for it and built it, the first concentration camp financed and erected by private industry. Auschwitz III Monowitz measured 270 by 490 meters. At the end of 1944, it housed 60 barracks of 17.5 by 8 meters. Between 1943 and 1944, approximately 35,000 inmates worked in the plant. Of them, 23,000 died from malnutrition, illness, and exhaustion, an average of 32 deaths per day. The deaths and transfers to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, too, reduced the population of the camp by almost 1/5 each month. But IG Farben was not the only company that had found in Auschwitz a business opportunity. Krupp and Siemens Schuckert also established factories with their own sub-camps. The ink used to tattoo the numbers on the forearms of the prisoners was manufactured by the Pelican Company, and Bayer, part then of IG Farben, paid 150 Reichsmarks for each group of 150 female prisoners of Auschwitz to test an anesthetic. There exists in the archives a letter from a Bayer employee to Höss that says, "The transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we could not obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We beg you to send us another group of women with the same quantity and at the same price." The smell of the crematoria of Auschwitz I and II drifted over the camp of Monowitz, depending on the direction of the wind. The administrators of the plant constantly threatened the prisoners with the gas chamber to maintain productivity. On August 20th, 1944, Allied airplanes bombed the IG Farben plant for the first time. They returned on September 13th, on the 18th, and on December 26th. The explosions destroyed facilities. The prisoners continued working in the rubble. On January 19th, 1945, the SS ordered the evacuation. The Block 10 of Auschwitz I was separated from Block 11 solely by a corridor and the courtyard known as the Wall of Death. While Block 11 represented punishment, Block 10 represented something qualitatively different: the systematic perversion of medical science at the service of Nazi ideology. The SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Klauberg injected chemical substances into the uteri of women to try to obstruct them permanently in the framework of a mass sterilization program. Horst Schumann irradiated with X-rays the genitals of men and women to provoke sterilization through radiation damage. The experiments did not follow verifiable scientific protocols, and their results never had recognized practical application in any legitimate scientific forum. The best known of the doctors of Auschwitz arrived at the camp on May 30th, 1943. Josef Mengele was 32 years old, SS Hauptsturmführer, doctor of medicine and of anthropology from the University of Frankfurt. He was posted to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he was assigned first to the camp of gypsy families and then to the selection ramp. Mengele was punctual, meticulous, correctly dressed. He personally supervised the arrivals of the trains, sometimes listening to classical music projected by loudspeakers of the camp while pointing with his thumb. His particular obsession was identical twins, also dwarfs, people with malformations, carriers of illnesses that he considered hereditary. He established in barracks 29 and 31 of Birkenau what the survivors described as a kindergarten for the children with whom he experimented, where they received better food rations than the rest of the camp. Eva Moses Kor, a survivor whose testimonies have been documented and who went through his experiments as a girl along with her twin sister, described decades later the announcement that Mengele repeated during the selection on the platform, "Zwillinge heraus," twins, a step forward, with the tone, Kor said, of someone handing out candies. The selected twins had all parts of their body measured, were photographed, and had dental, sight, and hearing analyses performed. Blood was extracted from them. Surgeries were performed on them. Cross-transfusions were practiced between the pair of twins. When one of the twins died, Mengele ordered the other to be killed to be able to perform simultaneous autopsies and compare the organs. Rudolf Brandt and Wolfram Sievers, General Director of the Ahnenerbe, the pseudoscientific research institute of the SS, delivered the skeletons of 87 Jewish prisoners selected for their physical characteristics to the Anatomical Institute of the Reichsuniversität in Strasbourg. The collection was authorized by Himmler and directed by Professor August Hirt. Brandt and Sievers were executed in 1948 after being convicted in the doctor's trial. The doctor's trial in Nuremberg, celebrated between 1946 and 1947, was the first of the 12 processes that followed the main Nuremberg trial. Its sentences articulated for the first time in international law the principles that constitute the Nuremberg Code on medical ethics, the voluntary consent of the subject, real scientific necessity, the possibility of withdrawal from the experiment. All those principles had been systematically violated in Auschwitz. Another doctor of the SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Heissmeyer, took 20 Polish Jewish children from Auschwitz to the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg, where he injected them with the tuberculosis bacillus to test possible cures. In April 1945, when the Allied advance threatened to cause the experiment to be discovered, the 20 children were murdered by hanging to hide the evidences. Auschwitz was designed to prevent resistance. It achieved it almost completely, almost. The first documented escape occurred on July 6, 1940, barely 3 weeks after the arrival of the first mass transport. Tadeusz Wiejowski, a Polish prisoner, managed to escape from the camp. He was captured and executed. The reprisal extended much further than him. The roll call that night lasted 19 hours, hundreds of prisoners standing during an entire night and most of the following day. According to the historian Henryk Swiebocki, at least 802 prisoners attempted to escape during the entire existence of the camp, 757 men and 45 women. Of them, 144 achieved it, 327 were captured. The destiny of the remaining 331 remained unknown. Among the most notable successes, on June 20, 1942, 4 Polish prisoners, Eugeniusz Bendera, Kazimierz Pieczowski, Stanisław Gustav Jasta, and Józef Lempart, broke into a warehouse, 3 of them dressed in SS uniforms, took rifles and a staff automobile, and left the camp with the 4th as a prisoner. Later they sent a letter to Höss apologizing for the loss of the vehicle. On July 21, 1944, the prisoner Jerzy Bilecki, dressed in an SS uniform and using a forged pass, crossed the camp gate with his Jewish girlfriend Syla Cybulska, whom he presented as a detainee who had to be interrogated. Both survived the war. Yad Vashem recognized Bilecki as righteous among the nations. On April 27, 1944, Rudolf Werber, serial number 44070, and Alfred Wetzler, number 29162, escaped to Slovakia, carrying with them detailed information about the gas chambers and the crematoria of Birkenau. The report they prepared, known as the Werber-Wetzler report, was the first document that described with technical precision the functioning of the extermination facilities of Auschwitz. Its distribution in June 1944 and its partial publication in several countries contributed to the decision of the Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy to temporarily halt deportations from Hungary. The Werber-Wetzler report, along with the testimonies of Arnost Rosin and Czesław Mordowicz, who escaped on May 27, 1944, and that of Jerzy Tabot himself, constituted the so-called Auschwitz Protocols, published in full in November 1944 by the War Refugee Board of the United States. And then, on October 7, 1944, something happened that the architects of the camp had calculated as impossible. The Sonderkommando rebelled. The trigger was the announcement that 300 of them would be transferred to clear rubble in a nearby village. The Sonderkommando knew what those transfers meant. That group, composed principally of Greek and Hungarian Jews, rose up. They attacked the SS with stones, hammers, and tools. They killed 3 guards. They set fire to Crematorium 4 with rags soaked in oil. The ones from Crematorium 2, upon hearing the explosion, believed that the revolt had begun in the entire camp. They threw their German capo into one of the ovens. They cut the electrified wire with pliers and fled toward Rajsko, where they hid in the barn of a subcamp of Auschwitz. The SS arrived, surrounded the barn, and set fire to the building. When the rebellion was crushed, 451 members of the Sonderkommando had been murdered. The remaining 212 lived several months more. One of those who died during the rebellion was Zalman Gradowski, who had buried his notebooks written in Yiddish near Crematorium 3. After the war, another survivor of the Sonderkommando indicated to the investigators where to dig. The notes were found and published decades later under the title From the Heart of Hell. The organized resistance also existed at another level, the informative one. Captain Witold Pilecki of the Polish Home Army let himself be arrested deliberately in Warsaw in September 1940 to be deported to Auschwitz with serial number 4859 under the alias Tomasz Serafiński. From within the camp, he organized the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, Union of Military Organizations, and regularly sent reports to the exterior about what was occurring. He escaped on April 27, 1943. His second report, known as the W Report, estimated that 1.5 million people, mostly Jews, had been murdered in Auschwitz. The Polish government in exile distributed that information among the Allies. The responses were slow, insufficient, or simply did not arrive. On January 18, 1945, Engelbert Markech, a German criminal transferred from Mauthausen, received serial number 202499. He was the last one. That same day, while the Red Army advanced from the east, the SS ordered the evacuation of the camp. Approximately 58,000 detainees, around two-thirds Jews, were forced to march toward the west on foot in the middle of the Polish winter, with temperatures that could reach 20 degrees below zero. Those who could not continue were murdered on the spot. The execution detachments followed the column and killed those who lagged behind. The historian Peter Longerich estimated that 1/4 of the deportees died during those marches toward Germany. On January 20th, crematoria 2 and 3 were blown up. On January 23rd, the Canada warehouses, where the belongings confiscated from the prisoners were stored, were set on fire. They burned for 5 days. Crematorium 5 was destroyed on January 26th, a day before the Red Army arrived. On January 27th, 1945, at 9 in the morning, a soldier of the 100th Rifle Division of the Red Army entered Auschwitz III, the IG Farben camp in Monowitz. Other units of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front arrived at Auschwitz I and II around 3 in the afternoon. They found 7,000 live prisoners in the 3 main camps, 500 more in the subcamps, and more than 600 corpses. They found 837,000 women's garments, 370,000 men's suits, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and the 7,000 kilograms of human hair in bags, ready to be sent to textile factories. The Soviet colonel Georgy Elisavetsky, who entered one of the barracks, recalled decades later that he tried to speak with the survivors in Russian, in Polish, in German, in Ukrainian. No response. Finally, he said a few words in Yiddish. He said he was Jewish. He said they had arrived to liberate them. He recounts that then, as if an inner barrier collapsed, the survivors ran toward the soldiers, knelt, kissed the lapels of their coats. Primo Levi, who was in the infirmary with scarlet fever, described the first 4 soldiers on horseback who approached. They cast strangely embarrassed glances at the bodies and at the few people who were still alive. "It was that shame that we knew so well," he wrote later. The feeling of guilt that such a crime existed, that it had been irrevocably introduced into the world of existing things. The final figures, according to the study of the historian Franciszek Piper published by Yad Vashem in 1991, are these: of the at least 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, at least 1.1 million were murdered. The breakdown: approximately 960,000 Jews, 865,000 of them gassed directly upon their arrival. 74,000 ethnic Poles, 21,000 Romani, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, between 10,000 and 15,000 citizens of other European nationalities. 1 in 6 Jews murdered in the Holocaust died in Auschwitz, the country of origin with the highest number of victims. Hungary, with 430,000 dead, followed by Poland with 300,000, France with 69,000, and the Netherlands with 60,000. The trials began before the camp had time to cool down. Rudolf Höss was arrested by the British on March 11, 1946, near Flensburg, where he lived under the alias of Franz Lang, working as a farmer. He was transferred to Nuremberg to testify in the trial of SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner. His statements about the process of extermination, pronounced with a calmness that disturbed even seasoned prosecutors, constituted fundamental evidence. He was extradited to Poland on May 25, 1946. He wrote his memoirs in prison, published in Polish in 1951 and in German in 1958, under the title Kommandant in Auschwitz. He was condemned to death on April 2, 1947. On April 16th, he was hanged in Auschwitz I, a few meters from Crematorium I. In Krakow on November 25, 1947, the Auschwitz trial began, in which the Polish Supreme National Tribunal prosecuted 40 former members of the camp staff. It concluded on December 22nd with 23 death sentences, 7 life sentences, and 9 prison sentences. Among those executed, Commander Arthur Lieberhenschel and the head of the women's camp, Maria Mandl. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, celebrated in West Germany from December 20, 1963 to August 20, 1965, lasted 180 days. 22 defendants. The indictment had 700 pages, accompanied by a 300-page historical report prepared by the Institut für Zeitgeschichte with the testimonies of 254 witnesses. Of the 22 defendants, 19 were convicted, 6 to life imprisonment, the others between 3 and 10 years. The SS doctor Horst Fischer, who had personally selected at least 75,000 people to be gassed, was tried in East Germany, condemned to death and executed in the guillotine in 1966. Of the approximately 6,335 members of the SS staff who worked in Auschwitz, no more than 789, less than 15%, were ever prosecuted. In 1947, the Polish government approved a law establishing the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum on the site of Auschwitz I and II. In 1979, UNESCO inscribed the site on the World Heritage List. In 2005, the General Assembly of the United Nations designated January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. In 2018, a survey commissioned by the Claims Conference found that 41% of American adults surveyed did not know what Auschwitz was. 22% declared never to have heard of the Holocaust. Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl, Elie Wiesel, Edith Eger, Simone Weil, survivors who wrote, testified, taught for decades. Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that even in the most degrading conditions imaginable, the freedom to choose one's own attitude in the face of suffering could not be taken away. Elie Wiesel said on the 50th anniversary of the liberation, "After Auschwitz, the human condition is no longer the same. After Auschwitz, nothing will ever be the same." Auschwitz began with a bureaucratic decision taken in Berlin, with an architect who signed a blueprint, with a company that calculated the profitability of slave labor, with a doctor who decided to point with his thumb to the right or to the left, with thousands of people who each day chose to participate, keep silent, or look the other way. The deepest horror of Auschwitz is that it was planned.